Aspiring sincerely to an international peace, the Japanese people forever renounced war as a sovereign right of the nation. It was the death of one Japan, and the birth of another, but that birth was not without pain. For the men of the sea, the officers, engineers, and sailors who had lived and died by the code of the waves, it was hard to find peace in a world without warships. They had spent their lives serving an empire that no longer existed. And yet, slowly, a realization began to emerge that perhaps, by losing everything, Japan had been given a chance to rediscover what truly mattered. The Admiral's ship would one day be scrapped, melted down, and reborn as steel for civilian industries, bridges, railways, homes. The empire that had ruled by the sword was now rebuilding itself with the tools of peace. But what of the spirit that had driven its navy, the pride, the discipline, the will to serve, that would find new life in an unexpected form as Japan prepared to rise again, not in conquest, but in resilience? The ashes of war became the soil of Japan's rebirth. In the years following surrender, the nation that once sought dominion over oceans turned inward, rebuilding from ruins both physical and spiritual. The clang of shipyards returned, not to forge battleships, but to construct merchant vessels, ferries, and fishing trawlers. The same hands that had crafted instruments of war now shaped the foundation of peace. The Imperial Japanese Navy was gone, but its discipline, precision, and mastery of engineering lived on. Many former naval officers, stripped of rank but not of knowledge, became the backbone of Japan's new maritime industries. Some helped establish the Maritime Safety Agency in 1948, the seed of what would later become the Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force, JMSDF. It was a quiet resurrection, a navy without an empire, serving not conquest, but protection. The transformation was profound. The war had taught Japan that steel and pride alone could not sustain a nation. Strength had to come from humility, innovation, and cooperation. Factories that once built torpedoes now built engines for cars and ships. Naval engineers turned their talents toward civilian technology, laying the groundwork for the economic miracle that would lift Japan from defeat to prosperity within a single generation. Yet for those who had lived through the war, the shift was not so simple. In every harbor and coastal town, memorials began to rise, small stone markers engraved with the names of ships and crews lost to the sea. Veterans gathered each year to bow their heads, not in anger, but in remembrance. They no longer celebrated victory or mourned defeat. They honored endurance, the human capacity to survive and begin again. The admiral who had wept beneath the American flag lived long enough to see that transformation. He never spoke publicly of that day, but his silence carried more meaning than any speech. In later years, he was seen attending naval memorials, standing quietly at the water's edge, hat in hand, his gaze fixed on the horizon. To younger officers of the new JMSDF, he was a living link to a past both painful and sacred. He taught them that the sea remembers everything, victories, defeats, and the cost of both. He reminded them that Japan's true power no longer lay in domination, but in mastery of self. His words, few and measured, became a quiet creed for a new generation. The ocean forgives only those who learn from it. As the decades passed, Japan's harbors filled once more with ships, sleek, modern, built for defense and aid rather than conquest. American vessels still docked at Yokosuka, but now as allies, not occupiers. The flags that once stood opposed now flew side by side. For the world, it was a symbol of reconciliation. For Japan, it was a promise kept to never again allow pride to blind wisdom or ambition to drown humanity. The admiral's tears, once shed in sorrow, came to represent something far greater, the moment a nation let go of its illusion of invincibility and embraced a new kind of strength, one measured not in guns, but in grace. And in the end, the ocean bore witness to both. The same sea that had swallowed Japan's empire now carried its reborn ships to every corner of the globe, bearing not soldiers, but aid, not fire, but friendship. The rising sun had set in 1945, but decades later, it rose again, not as a symbol of domination, but of peace earned through understanding. And somewhere, beneath the waves, the ghosts of the old Navy rest quietly, knowing that their story did not end with defeat. It simply found a new beginning. The empire's steel had melted into bridges and homes. The admiral's tears had dried into history. But the lesson, that pride without reflection leads to ruin, endured. The war had ended, but its echo had become wisdom. And that wisdom, born in sorrow, would define Japan's place in the modern world. The sea has no memory, yet it carries all memories. It does not care who wins, who rules, or who falls. It only endures. For centuries, Japan's fate was bound to that sea. It rose from it, it fought upon it, and it nearly perished because of it. When the Admiral wept beneath the flag of his conqueror, he was not mourning merely the loss of a war. He was mourning the illusion that power could exist without conscience, that honor could be preserved through destruction. His tears were not weakness, they were clarity. Those tears marked the end of one Japan and the beginning of another. The empire that had sought to dominate the Pacific vanished beneath the waves, but from its ruins emerged a nation reborn through humility. The steel that once armored battleships became the skeleton of a new era, bridges, trains, and skyscrapers rising where once stood arsenals and dry docks. The same spirit of discipline and craftsmanship that had forged weapons now built peace. History remembers the wars, but it is peace that tests a nation's soul. And Japan, once defined by conquest, proved that endurance could be nobler than victory. In the decades that followed, the country turned its mastery of precision and resolve toward creation, not destruction, becoming a beacon of innovation, resilience, and restraint. The Admiral's tears, shed beneath a foreign flag, became the first drops of that renewal. They symbolize the truth written in every war's aftermath, that the greatest victories are not won on battlefields, but within the human heart, when pride gives way to understanding and vengeance yields to reflection. Today, the harbors of Yokosuka and Kyoto still echo with the sounds of ships, not warships preparing for conquest, but vessels carrying aid, science, and cooperation across the same oceans that once burned with fire. And when the wind moves just right, the sea seems to whisper an old name, not in sorrow, but in peace. For in the end, the Admiral did not weep for defeat. He wept for the cost of learning what victory truly means. Behind him, the ship groaned softly, as if sighing in relief. It had survived its final battle. So had he, and yet both knew that survival was not victory. It was memory, a duty to remember what pride had built and what pride had destroyed. As night fell, the harbor lights flickered on. Across the water, American warships lay anchored, their silhouettes dark against the sea. Once enemies, now guardians of a fragile peace. For a long time, the Admiral watched the two flags, his and theirs, flutter side by side in the wind, not as rivals, not as conqueror and conquered, but as symbols of the world that war had remade. And in that quiet, as the waves lapped gently against the hull, he whispered a prayer, not for victory, not for vengeance, but for understanding. Because even in defeat, there's honor in remembering. And on that night, as the tide pulled softly against the dock, Japan's navy, and the dream it carried, finally drifted into history. The waves that washed over Yokosuka carried away more than ships. They carried away an empire's soul. But what followed in the years to come would transform those tears of surrender into the quiet strength of rebirth. The occupation of Japan began not with violence, but with silence. In September 1945, American troops landed on the beaches and fields of defeated nation. Tanks rolled through shattered streets. The rising sun flags that once fluttered proudly above fortresses and ships were replaced by the stars and stripes. Yet there was no resistance. The people did not fight. They watched, weary, starved, and hollow. The Imperial Japanese Navy, once the guardian of the nation's pride, ceased to exist. By order of the Allied command, its ships were disarmed, its bases occupied, its officers dismissed. The name that had once stirred awe, Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, Zuikaku, became legend spoken of in past tense. The remnants of the fleet were divided into three categories: vessels to be scuttled, vessels to be scrapped, and a few to be studied by the victors. At Kyoto, Sasebo, and Yokosuka, ship after ship met its end. Explosives were placed in their hulls. Anchors were cut loose. The sea that had once been Japan's greatest ally became its grave. Some American officers watched the process with respect, even sorrow. They knew what these ships had meant to their enemies, not just machines of war, but symbols of an entire civilization's ambition. The Nagato, the last surviving Japanese battleship and once Admiral Yamamoto's flagship, was spared temporarily. The Americans took her to Bikini Atoll, where she became a test subject in the atomic experiments of 1946. There, under the blinding light of humanity's new weapon, the pride of the Imperial Navy met her second and final death. Her wreck still lies beneath the lagoon, a ghostly monument to the transition from the age of steel to the age of the atom. Meanwhile, back in Japan, former admirals and officers face a new kind of battle, survival in peacetime. Many were interrogated by Allied investigators, questioned about war crimes and strategies. Others simply faded into anonymity. The samurai class of the sea had no place in the Japan that was being rebuilt. For those who had dedicated their lives to the Navy, the loss was personal, spiritual, and eternal. Men who had commanded fleets now worked as laborers or teachers. Some could not bear the humiliation and ended their lives quietly. Others, like the admiral who had stood beneath the foreign flag, endured, choosing instead to teach younger generations about the cost of pride and the meaning of peace. The bases that had once buzzed with warplanes became hubs of American power. Yokosuka, where the admiral had once commanded his fleet, was now home to the U.S. 7th Fleet, the very force that had defeated him. The irony was heavy, but Japan had no choice but to accept it. In those early years of occupation, a strange transformation began to take root. Where once there had been fury, there grew reflection. The war had stripped Japan bare, its military, its industry, its illusions. In that emptiness, something new began to form. American officers, led by General Douglas MacArthur, did not destroy Japan entirely. They rebuilt it, piece by piece, law by law. The emperor remained, but his divinity was renounced. The armed forces were disbanded, replaced by words in a new constitution, words that would redefine the nation's soul. At Yokosuka, one of those ships was a former pride of the fleet, a heavy cruiser whose decks had once gleamed with imperial authority. It had sailed in victory and in loss. It had survived torpedoes, bombings, and the slow starvation of Japan's naval blockade. Now, its final act would not be battle, but surrender. American sailors came aboard first. Young men, many barely in their 20s, climbing the gangway of a ship that had been their enemy. They moved quietly, respectfully, no cheers, no taunts. War had made them old before their time, and victory carried as much sorrow as pride. On the quarterdeck, the Japanese admiral stood at attention. His uniform, pressed and spotless, was a last remnant of order amid ruin. Behind him, his officers lined up, their faces carved from stone. No one spoke. The sound of boots on metal echoed through the harbor like a slow drumbeat. Then came the signal. An American officer unfolded the stars and stripes. Another stepped forward with a rope. The wind was light, barely enough to move the water's surface, but as the flag began to rise, it caught the air like a living thing. Every Japanese officer watched it ascend. None saluted. None turned away. For them, it was more than a symbol of occupation. It was the end of a 1,000-year story, the shattering of the illusion that Japan's divine destiny ruled the seas. And at that moment, the admiral's composure broke. A single tear slid down his cheek, tracing the weathered line of a face that had known both triumph and devastation. He did not cry for himself. He cried for his men, for the generations of sailors who had believed that Japan's empire would last forever, for the nation that had built gods of steel only to see them fall into the sea. He cried because the flag now waving above his ship was not merely a conqueror's banner. It was a mirror, reflecting what Japan had lost and what the world had become. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The Americans finished their duty, securing the flag. The Japanese stood in silence. For the first time in centuries, a foreign emblem flew over a ship of the Imperial Navy. In that stillness, the admiral removed his cap and bowed, not to the victors, but to the sea itself, to the memory of every sailor who had vanished beneath its waves, to the empire that had lived and died upon it. For the Americans watching, it was a moment they would never forget. Not triumph, not humiliation. Something deeper, a shared understanding that war, at its end, leaves no glory, only ghosts. Above the harbor, gulls circled, crying through the mist. The stars and stripes fluttered against the windless sky, the same sky under which two nations had destroyed each other, and, in doing so, had changed the world forever. The admiral turned slowly and walked below deck. Behind him, the ship creaked, no longer a weapon, but a relic. The war had ended. But for those who had lived it, peace would never feel like victory. The Admiral's footsteps echoed through the corridors of his ship, hollow, metallic, unending. Each sound was a reminder of what once had been. The shouts of sailors, the thunder of engines, the heartbeat of a nation that had believed itself invincible. Now, only silence answered. In that stillness, he reached the Admiral's cabin, untouched since the war's final days. On the wall hung a framed portrait of the Emperor, edges charred from a nearby bombing. The desk still held a compass, a logbook, and a ceremonial sword wrapped in cloth. The sword was his father's, a relic of the old samurai class, passed down through generations of service. He unwrapped it carefully, tracing a finger along the cold steel. This blade had symbolized honor, loyalty, and the purity of sacrifice. Yet now, it felt heavy, not with duty, but with the weight of failure. He knew that many of his peers had chosen to die rather than surrender. Some had gone down with their ships, others with pistols in their cabins. He had chosen to live, not out of cowardice, but because someone had to witness the end. Outside, the harbor lay quiet beneath the gray light of afternoon. American landing craft moved between the wrecks, carrying soldiers and engineers to inspect the captured vessels. Each ship told the same story: broken turrets, empty magazines, shattered pride. The once mighty Yamato-class fleet was gone. The carriers that had launched the Pearl Harbor attack were rusting at the bottom of the sea. The destroyers that had screened them lay in twisted heaps of steel along the coast. Japan's navy, once the world's most disciplined and daring, no longer existed. In the days that followed, American forces began the slow process of dismantling what remained. Guns were removed. Ammunition was dumped into the sea. Radios were dismantled. Flags confiscated. Japanese officers supervised in silence, their faces masks of composure hiding unspoken grief. Some ships were scuttled by their own crews, under Allied supervision, a final act of dignity granted to those who had built them. Others were towed away to serve under new flags, stripped of identity and history. The line between honor and humiliation blurred with each passing day. For the Admiral, the hardest part was not surrendering his ship. It was watching the men who had survived. Young sailors stood on the docks, staring at the ocean as though it no longer recognized them. They had been trained to fight until death. Now they were ordered to live in defeat. Many could not reconcile the two. They spoke little, ate little, their eyes hollow. The Empire had not just lost a war, it had lost its meaning. In private, the Admiral wrote in his logbook one final time: "We built our ships to rule the waves, and they have become our graves. The sea has taken all that we gave it, our youth, our hope, our future. Yet it remains the same. Only we have changed." When the Americans finally left his ship that evening, the flag still fluttered in the harbor light. The sun was setting over the mountains, turning the gray water into gold. For a moment, the Admiral felt the strange peace that comes when the inevitable has finally arrived. He stood on the deck and looked toward the horizon, the same horizon he had watched as a young officer decades earlier. Back then, the ocean had seemed infinite, full of promise and conquest. Now it seemed vast in another way, as a reminder how small human ambition truly was. A nation that refused to bow, even as the sea consumed it. And yet, in the final months, leadership took on a new meaning. Some admirals, weary, broken, but lucid, began to see beyond the myth. They realized that survival, not death, might now serve Japan best. When the Emperor finally spoke his word to surrender, many officers bowed their heads, not in defiance, but in grief. It was the moment they ceased being warriors and became witnesses to the death of their world. Across the Pacific, a very different kind of leadership had emerged. Where Japan worshipped courage and precision, America worshipped logistics and innovation. The U.S. Navy's strength was not in a single ship or commander, but in its system. Factories in California, shipyards in Virginia, and assembly lines in Detroit all beat as one industrial heart. While Japan forged titans, America built fleets, swarms of carriers, destroyers, submarines, and planes that could be replaced faster than they could be destroyed. Admirals like Chester Nimitz, William Halsey, and Raymond Spruance understood what Yamamoto had feared, that technology, intelligence, and supply would decide the war. Their strategy was methodical, island by island, base by base, closing the distance to Japan's home waters. Where the Imperial Navy saw the ocean as sacred, the Americans saw it as a battlefield to be mapped, measured, and conquered. They fought with mathematics, radar, and cryptography as much as with torpedoes and bombs. By 1944, American codebreakers were reading Japan's signals before Japan's own ships could receive them. Every ambush became a trap for the ambitious. At Leyte Gulf, American pilots turned the tide of naval history. Waves of aircraft darkened the sky, diving on Japanese ships that had no air cover left. The sea that had once carried Japan's empire now reflected only American fire. For the Japanese admirals watching from afar, the realization was devastating. They had been defeated not only by superior numbers, but by superior thinking. Where they had built a navy of warriors, America had built a navy of machines and minds. The flag that would one day rise over their captured ships was not only a symbol of conquest, it was a mark of a new era in warfare. When the war ended, the battlefield did not fall silent. It echoed with a question: what does honor mean when your nation has fallen? For Japan, surrender was not simply military, it was moral disintegration. Centuries of samurai tradition had taught that death was preferable to dishonor. To live under the enemy's flag was unthinkable. Yet the emperor's voice commanded obedience, and obedience was the highest form of loyalty. So the officers stood still as American troops entered their harbors. They did not resist, but neither did they salute. They watched as the rising sun was lowered from their ships, as foreign hands raised a flag they had once been taught to despise. Some could not bear the sight. In those final weeks, many took their own lives, admirals, captains, even young cadets. They saw it not as despair, but as a final act of purity. Others endured, their pride shattered but their discipline unbroken. They saluted the victors, tended to the wounded, and helped dismantle the very ships they once commanded. And when one admiral, nameless in history, but immortal in memory, wept as the American flag rose above his ship, his tears spoke for all of them. They were not tears of rage, not even a hatred. They were the quiet acknowledgement of truth. That valor and faith, no matter how fierce, could not overcome the machinery of progress and time. Honor had not been lost. It had simply changed shape. And as the stars and stripes rippled in the harbor wind, even those who had fought against it could sense what it represented. The dawn of a new world, one born from the ashes of the old. The war's moral center had shifted. The leaders who once ruled the waves had become the defeated, and the enemy they once underestimated now commanded their oceans and their future. But one final moment would seal that transformation, the climax of surrender itself, when the Japanese fleet's last surviving pride was taken, and history turned from glory to grief. August 1945. The Pacific War was over, but Japan's ocean still carried the echoes of a vanished empire. The land burned beneath atomic fire. Hiroshima and Nagasaki lay in ruin. Above the waves, silence had replaced the thunder of guns. The Imperial Navy, once the pride of a nation, was now a scattered skeleton, anchored in surrender. At the great naval base of Yokosuka, ships that had once ruled the seas rested beneath gray skies. Their paint blistered, decks scarred, the rising sun flags faded to pale pink ghosts. The Americans had arrived. On September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Japan's representatives signed the instrument of surrender. Around them, the waters shimmered with the presence of Allied might, more than 250 warships standing silent, their guns aimed at history itself. The ceremony lasted less than half an hour. When it ended, the Japanese Empire, which had once stretched from Manchuria to the Solomon Islands, ceased to exist. Yet the true weight of defeat was not felt in Tokyo Bay, but in the harbors where Japanese officers stood beside their own ships and watched the conqueror's flag rise. The Imperial Navy died not with surrender, but with silence, swallowed by the Philippine Sea. By 1945, Japan's fleet was no longer a navy, but a memory. Fuel was scarce. Ships stayed anchored for lack of oil. The great harbors of Kyo and Yokosuka were graveyards, rusting hulls lined side by side, their flags still flying in defiance of inevitability. And in April of that year, the Yamato herself sailed on her final mission, Operation Tengo, a one-way voyage to Okinawa, with just enough fuel for the journey out. She never returned. American carrier planes struck her mid-transit, sending the pride of the empire to the bottom of the sea. Her death marked more than the loss of a ship. It marked the death of Japan's imperial dream. When the emperor finally spoke on August 15th, 1945, his words were quiet, almost unreadable through the static of a radio. We must endure the unendurable. The war was over. The rising sun was lowered, and the navy that had once conquered the Pacific now awaited its final humiliation, disarmament, occupation, and surrender of its proudest vessels. Among them was one ship whose name had once been whispered with reverence across the empire. Now, American sailors would climb her deck, lower her tattered ensign, and raise their own. And somewhere among the silent ranks of Japanese officers, an admiral would watch, powerless, unarmed, and broken. The flag that once symbolized conquest would now mark surrender. And the tears that fell that day were not for defeat alone. They were for the end of everything Japan had once believed itself to be. For the men of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a ship was more than steel. It was spirit, identity, an extension of the soul. From the moment a sailor first stepped onto deck, he ceased to exist as an individual. His heart belonged to the vessel, his life to the emperor, and his death to the sea. This was the creed of Kaigun no Saishin, the spirit of a navy. They rose before dawn, polishing brass fittings until they gleamed like mirrors, reciting prayers before the portrait of the emperor. To serve aboard a capital ship like the Nagato or Yamato was not merely duty, it was destiny. Men volunteered for assignments they knew could not return. The war changed them, but never broke their devotion. Even as the tide turned and Japan's defeat loomed, discipline never faltered. Crews slept in ruined ships during air raids, refusing to abandon their posts. They believed that to die with their ship was the purest form of loyalty, an echo of samurai tradition carried into a mechanized age. When the surrender came, it was not simply a political event. It was a spiritual collapse. Many officers could not comprehend the order to lay down arms. Some took their own lives aboard their vessels rather than witness occupation. Others, like the admiral who stood in Yokosuka that gray morning, obeyed, but carried the weight of that obedience forever. For those who survived, the sight of the American flag replacing the rising sun was an unbearable contradiction. Honor without victory, obedience without purpose. They had lived as warriors, but now were expected to live as men who had lost their gods. And as the stars and stripes climbed the mast of their ship, they understood something profound, that the empire they had fought for had dissolved not in flames, but in silence. If the men of Japan's navy were bound by spirit, their ships were monuments to ambition. In the years before the war, Japan's engineers pursued perfection in naval architecture, precision without compromise. Every rivet, every turret, every bolt carried the pride of a nation determined to rival the West. Ships like Yamato were not built for strategy, they were built for symbolism. At 862 feet long, with 9 18.1-inch guns, the largest naval artillery ever fitted to a warship, she embodied power on a mythical scale. Her armor was thick enough to shrug off almost any shell, her firepower designed to annihilate anything afloat. She was a floating embodiment of Japan's belief in invincibility. Yet in that magnificence lay her doom. While Japan poured its dwindling resources into colossal battleships, the United States invested in aircraft carriers, radar systems, and logistical networks. The age of steel giants was ending, and Japan did not see it coming. The Imperial Navy's doctrine still clung to the Kantai-Kessen, the decisive battle between surface fleets. It was an echo of the 1905 Tsushima victory, fossilized into dogma. Admirals envisioned a grand clash where battleships would line up across the horizon, trading thunderous salvos until one side prevailed. But the next war belonged to the sky. At Midway, Japan's greatest ships were destroyed not by other battleships, but by squadrons of carrier-based bombers, machines faster, cheaper, and deadlier than any naval gun. Technology had rewritten the rules of war, and Japan's naval philosophy could not keep up. Still, they built. Musasha followed Yamato, each ship consuming more steel than Japan's factories could afford. By 1944, even with fuel reserves nearly gone, Tokyo continued to pour resources into these behemoths, as if to build one more god-protect a dying empire. When Yamato sailed on her final mission, she carried not just crew and ammunition, but the last of Japan's naval faith. Every man aboard knew the truth. She was sailing to die. And when she exploded beneath American bombs, splitting in two before sinking into the deep, the shockwaves were not only physical, They shattered a century of belief in the battleship as the heart of power. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. The age of the gun had ended. The age of the machine and the mind had begun. Japan had built masterpieces of steel, but America had built the system that destroyed them. As Japan's harbors filled with silent hulks, both sailor and ship shared the same fate, beautiful, obsolete, and broken. The empire's soul had been bound to its vessels, and when those vessels sank, so too did its pride. Yet the human heart and the machine it commanded are never separate. The next chapter of this story would test that bond, between leaders and men, between honor and survival, between obedience and despair. To lead the Imperial Japanese Navy in the final years of the war was to command ghosts. The admirals who once believed themselves heirs to Admiral T.G.'s triumph at Tsushima now presided over ruin, stripped of fuel, ships, and hope. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, had foreseen this end long before it came. His brilliance lay not in arrogance but in tragic foresight. "In the first 6 months," he warned, "I will run wild and win victory upon victory. But if the war continues after that, I have no expectation of success." His words became prophecy. After Yamamoto's death in 1943, his planes shot down by American P-38s in Operation Vengeance, leadership passed to men who inherited his burden but not his options. Admiral Shishi Nagumo, who once led the carrier strike on Pearl Harbor, faced a relentless tide at Midway and later at Guadalcanal. When defeat became certain, he chose suicide rather than surrender. Admiral Suimu Toyoda, who commanded during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, sent the last remnants of the fleet into hopeless combat. He knew they would never return. To these men, surrender was not strategy, it was dishonor. Their duty was to fight until their ships were gone, their ammunition spent, and their lives extinguished in service to the emperor. They led not for victory, but for the preservation of the idea of Japan. August 1945. The harbor at Yokosuka lies in eerie stillness. The air is heavy with the smell of oil and salt, mingling with a faint, metallic scent of burned steel. Warships, once the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, rest broken and silent, their decks twisted by fire, their gun barrels bent toward the sea like defeated warriors. At the far end of the pier, a group of American sailors stand beneath a gray sky. In their hands, the stars and stripes, folded and ready. Opposite them, a line of Japanese officers, motionless, expressionless, their white caps flecked with rain. Among them stands an admiral, his uniform immaculate despite the ruin around him. His eyes are fixed on one ship in particular, a massive, wounded vessel that once carried his flag, his crew, his pride. As the American flag begins to rise over the ship's mast, the admiral's breath trembles. For years, that mast bore the rising sun, symbol of an empire that once dreamed of conquering oceans. Now, beneath the same gray heavens, it bears the colors of its conqueror. The admiral's face does not break. Only when the flag catches the wind does a single tear trace down his cheek. And so begins the story of the empire that fell upon the sea it once ruled. The story of the admiral's tears does not begin in 1945. It begins 40 years earlier, with victory, pride, and a dream of mastery over the seas. In 1905, the world watched in disbelief as Japan, a nation once dismissed as feudal and backward, shattered the Russian Baltic fleet at the Battle of Tsushima. Under Admiral T.G. Heihachu, Japan became the first Asian power in modern history to defeat a European empire at sea. The victory was not only military, it was psychological. It told the world that Japan had entered the modern age, and it told the Japanese people that destiny, not geography, would define their power. From that day forward, the ocean became sacred ground. Japan's leaders saw the sea as both shield and sword, the pathway of trade, the theater of conquest, and the measure of national pride. The Imperial Japanese Navy was born in that belief. By the 1930s, it had become one of the most advanced maritime forces on Earth. British naval doctrines had been studied, absorbed, and then improved upon. Shipyards at Kure, Yokosuka, and Sasebo roared with steel and ambition. Engineers designed warships not only to fight, but to dominate. Among these visionaries stood Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, a man of contradictions, Harvard-educated, fluent in English, yet fiercely loyal to the emperor. He understood America better than almost any of his peers, and that understanding haunted him. Yamamoto knew that war with the United States would be a gamble against a nation with 10 times Japan's industrial strength. Yet, when that war came, it would be his hand that drew the first strike. In the late 1930s, Japan's imperial expansion accelerated. Manchuria had fallen. China was bleeding. The empire's appetite grew. To fuel its engines and ships, Japan looked south to the oil-rich Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the Philippines. But the United States stood in the way. When Washington imposed embargoes on oil and steel, Tokyo saw it not as diplomacy but strangulation. The question within Japan's war councils was no longer if they should fight America, but when. Yamamoto's mind turned to strategy. He knew Japan could not win a long war of attrition, but perhaps it could win a short, decisive one. If America's Pacific Fleet could be crippled in one blow, Japan could seize the Western Pacific before the United States had time to recover. Thus, the plan for Pearl Harbor was born. It was a strike born of desperation and brilliance. 6 carriers, hundreds of aircraft, and months of meticulous planning. On December 7, 1941, the rising sun climbed over Oahu as Japanese bombers descended upon the sleeping fleet. Battleships burned. The sea turned black with oil and fire. In Tokyo, the people rejoiced. The emperor's radio declared a great victory. But Yamamoto did not celebrate. When informed of the success, he reportedly said, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He understood that Japan had fired its brightest shot, and that the recoil would be catastrophic. Still, for the first 6 months of 1942, the Imperial Navy ruled the Pacific. The names of its ships echoed like legends: Akagi, Kaga, Hari, Sry, Nagato, Yamato. The rising sun stretched across half the ocean. Manila, Singapore, and the Dutch East Indies fell like dominoes. For a moment, Japan seemed unstoppable. But in every empire's rise lies the seed of overreach. Even as Japan celebrated, America was rebuilding, faster than anyone believed possible. And in June 1942, fate turned sharply at a place called Midway. It was there that the empire's expansion halted, and the tide of the Pacific began to reverse. The ocean that had once carried Japan's dreams would soon become the grave of its fleet. The fall began quietly, in signals intercepted, in overconfidence ignored, and in a storm of aircraft that would forever change naval warfare. The calm after Midway was an illusion, the eye of a storm that would swallow an empire. In just a few hours of battle in June 1942, Japan lost 4 of its frontline carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Sry, and Hari, along with hundreds of irreplaceable pilots. For a navy built on elite skill and precision, the loss was not just material, it was spiritual. The rising sun that had once burned across the Pacific began to dim. Yet in Tokyo, few accepted the truth. The Imperial Navy's admirals clung to their doctrine, the decisive battle. They believed one grand engagement could still change the war, one strike of steel and honor that would erase the humiliation of Midway. But the Americans were no longer playing by those rules. From 1943 onward, the U.S. Navy unleashed the full weight of its industry. New carriers rolled off assembly lines every few months. Radar, code breaking, and mass production combined to form a war machine unlike any the world had seen. Where Japan built 1 ship, America built 10. Where Japan trained 100 pilots, America trained thousands. The tide turned not in a single battle, but through a relentless storm of attrition. At Guadalcanal, Japan's veteran aviators and Marines fought with unmatched ferocity, but they bled out faster than they could be replaced. By 1944, Japan's naval air arm, once the envy of the world, was a hollow shell, flown by young men with only weeks of training. Still, the empire refused to yield. New weapons were forged from desperation. The colossal battleship Musashi, followed by her even greater sister, Yamato, 70,000 tons of armor and firepower, the largest warships ever built. They were floating fortresses, monuments to a dying faith in battleship supremacy. But technology had shifted. The future belonged not to big guns, but to the carrier's wing. At Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the largest naval battle in history, Japan gambled everything. Admiral Toyoda's fleet sailed out to meet the Americans in a complex, desperate plan meant to crush the U.S. invasion of the Philippines. It was a final, tragic echo of Tsushima, a battle of pride, waged with courage but no hope. The result was annihilation. Musasha sank under waves of American torpedoes and bombs. Over 1,000 men went down with her. Other Japanese ships fought until their decks burned white-hot, their ammunition spent, their crews refusing to abandon ship.